Yes. Um, we are recording this event, so kindly just keep yourselves muted if you don't mind until the end, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. Welcome to Sovereignty and Governance for Indigenous Data Futures by Dr. Stephanie R. Carroll. I am Christine Mallinson, the director of our Center for Social Science Scholarship, which is hosting today's event, and also joined by members of our faculty working group on Indigenous knowledges. We are going to post a recording. I'm going to put the link in the chat. We're going to post a recording on our YouTube channel and CS3's YouTube channel, probably today or tomorrow after the event. So you can also consult it there or share with anybody who might have missed it. And just a reminder, please also follow us on social media and on MyUMBC if you haven't, for more wonderful events like today. So I'm going to turn it over to our students, Autumn and Val, to do today's introduction. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for being here today. I'll be reading Dr. Stephanie Carroll's bio. So thank you. Just stay tuned. So start off with Dr. Stephanie Carroll is a citizen of the Native Village of Kluti-Kaah in Alaska and of Sicilian-descent. At the University of Arizona, she is Associate Professor of Public Health, Associate Director for the Native Nations Institute, and Associate Research Professor at the Udall Center. Her research group, the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance, develops research, policy, and practice innovations for Indigenous data sovereignty. Her research, teaching, and engagement seek to transform institutional governance and ethics for Indigenous control of Indigenous and data, particularly with open science, open data, and big data contexts. Stephanie co-edited the book Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Policy and led the publication of the CARE Principles for Indigenous Data Governance. Stephanie co-founded the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network and co-founded and chairs the Global Indigenous Data Alliances, the International Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group at the Research Data Alliances, and the Indigenous Data Working Group for the IEEE P2890 Recommended Practice for Provenance of Indigenous People Data. So thank you, and I'll give it to Dr. Stephanie Carroll.
Janan, Adam, Sidak Atnakistan, Sidak Stephanie Carroll, Tishu Stas, Landek Nalchina. Stephanie Carroll, and as Adam said, I'm Atna from the Native Village of Kluti-Kaah, which is along the Copper River in Alaska. So if you've heard or eaten Copper River salmon, that's the place. So today I'm joining you from Tucson, now known as Tucson, Arizona. A place which many Indigenous peoples have been through over the years, but are the ancestral homelands of the Tanatha Nation, and now also home to the Pasquayaqui tribe. Next slide, please. I just wanted to start with a little bit about my background and my research group. So first, my academic background is a combination of Indigenous studies, science and technology studies, qualitative and quantitative research methods, minors in sociology, and then of course my degrees are actually in public health. So over the past 2 decades or more now, I've worked at the University of Arizona's Native Nations Institution, which is known as NNI. And our focus there is on strengthening Indigenous governance. So the primary focus of my work has been on that. And so I've pursued these governance explorations with tribes and at kind of the aggregate level through environmental policy, health policy, and now through data policy. So since 2015, I've been in a joint position between the Udall Center and its Native Nations Institute, and then the College of Public Health. And so just acknowledging that in the work that I'm responsible to my community, to my family, to my ancestors, and that just the real importance of understanding that our best learnings and work take place on the land. Next slide. So I direct the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance, which is an international research network. We build upon and support the movement to develop new institutional frameworks that center the terms of Indigenous peoples around research and data partnerships. So our team members engage tribal rights holders and institutional data actors through research, education, and advocacy to understand the barriers that they face to identify opportunities for change. Our real goal is to move beyond mere recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights to data towards institutional policy and practice changes that protect and strengthen Indigenous peoples' relationships with their data, information, and knowledge. Next slide. So this is a pretty white slide with a lot of black words on it, and but it is my focusing slide. So this will be the most that you hear me talk for a slide here. I just want to give my positioning on where I come to and how I phrase the background of the work that I do around data relations. So sovereignty really matters, and it is central to relationships, be they government to government, research data, or otherwise. So Indigenous peoples in America hold inherent sovereignty, including people in the continental states who may or may not be federally recognized or state recognized, within Alaska, Hawaii, and also within the territories of American Samoa, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And also acknowledging that in America today, we have a number of Indigenous peoples from other places as well. So before colonization, Indigenous peoples lived healthy, vibrant lives aligned with their values, worldviews, and traditions. And so over the past 500 years, the settler colonial experience really has been comprised of various efforts to kill, suppress, or co-opt Indigenous peoples, their people, and our knowledge systems. So today, Indigenous peoples in America are a small fraction of the total US population because of systematic harms and systemic violence. Government-sanctioned policies and practices have and continue to attempt to decimate our health and well-being, our traditional ways, and our wealth. So these settler colonial efforts to suppress Indigenous knowledges likewise sought to wipe out traditions that promoted health and well-being, often replacing these with systems that the federal government projects that do not uphold treaty and trust obligations to support the health and well-being of our peoples. So Indigenous peoples bear the burden of disproportionately high disease rates, including, like we saw during COVID, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and more. While rates vary across tribes, they carry across generations and result in the highest rate of premature death in the country. So often we link these health inequities to social determinants of health, such as economics and education, or structural determinants like racism and discrimination. However, the root of these social and structural disparities lies in the systematic, coordinated, ongoing effort to diminish and erase us and subjugate Indigenous peoples while, and this is a really important point, disconnecting us from our lands. So nevertheless, in the face of this settler colonial experience, we exist and we thrive, due in large part to our knowledges, our relationships with the lands and non-humans, and ingenuity, the innovation and persistence that sustains us in the face of continuous attempts at colonial subjugation. So often the data that have been used to further assess the progress of the colonial project to kill and erase Indigenous people. So those data have been created and used to measure how well we are being made invisible or actually being erased entirely. And so Indigenous peoples today need decolonized, indigenized data for decision-making that shifts the narrative from deficits and deficiencies to well-being, resurgence, and persistence. So at the same time, while we need this data that better reflects us and is more useful to us, tribes are enacting relational responsibilities to their data. So they're governing their data in ways that align with their values and interests. And so these data include data that tribes own and control, as well as data created, stewarded, and used by others. So these data are our relations, and they link us as Indigenous peoples to our responsibilities to the information and the people and the non-humans to which it relates. And so finally, in closing on this, time and time again, Indigenous communities have shown that when they call the shots, when they create and give life to programs, when they embody relations with their data, when they apply their knowledge systems to govern public health and healthcare systems, their peoples and communities and their lands thrive. And so how can researchers, repositories, funders, and other institutions support this shift to self-determined community-engaged science? And one important way is through changing data relationships. Next slide. So during COVID, we saw globally that the needs and concerns of Indigenous peoples and the ethics of engaging with Indigenous peoples were often abandoned or omitted. This is echoed in other crisis situations, such as times of war, or in responding to climate change crisis. And these disproportionately impact Indigenous peoples who live in close relationships to their sacred ecosystem. So in these situations, human rights and data ethics often become an afterthought to crisis intervention. And as we think about future open science policies that we're all being held to now, we need to think both about ethical data policies and data infrastructure that embed Indigenous authority and ethics into their frameworks to ensure that Indigenous peoples are not forgotten again. Next slide, please. So as part of her dissertation research, my colleague, Dr. Dominique David Chavez, developed the scale of levels of Indigenous community engagement in research to assess for how researchers access Indigenous knowledges and knowledge systems and how they engage with communities and community members who maintain those systems. So this was adapted from a participatory agriculture research framework, and it's really based on who holds authority and governance in the research process. And so it ranges on the left from no engagement, representing really extractive processes and practices of research, to, on the left, self-determined Indigenous-led processes. So if you click again, we'll see that when Dr. David Chavez applied this to a global systematic review analyzing 20 years of climate studies that included Indigenous knowledges in their research, 87% of those studies, the vast majority of them, fell on this left side of the spectrum where they were extractive research practices. Click again, and we'll see on the right side there were a handful of studies as well as numerous grassroots efforts that live on the self-determined scale. And so we need to think about more about what is the success of the self-determined scale? How do we move research practices from the extractive experiences and policies that we've had over to this left side so that we can have this merging of self-determination within research and data and pursue that in terms of strategies for moving forward. Next slide. So one other kind of piece of background, and this is important for those of us who do any work with human subjects, right, is that, click again, in the US, we're beholden to this, the common rule for that regulates human subjects research. And so our institutions often have institutional review boards or IRBs that we go through if we're doing surveys or interviews. And so in this review that we did really in about 2018, led by Dr. Natabe Garrison, it updated a review of policies for human subjects in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the US that had been done about every decade. And we changed the schema, so we were looking more at how it aligned with Indigenous peoples' rights and interests. And you see these areas here that we evaluated. And what we found is that if you click again, in the US, in this red box here, you see a lot of gray. And so that means we didn't find these indicators present. And so our US common rule, which regulates human subjects research, really fails to protect tribal collective rights and interests. There's no requirement to engage communities. There's no requirement for community approval for secondary use of data and specimens, for community review or approval of research findings before release. And then there's absolutely no provision for sanctions for misuse of samples or data. And so this was updated, actually, the common rule was updated in 2018. And while disappointing, we know it won't be updated anytime soon, but we can push for action within other sectors, such as federal grant-making agencies, universities, and tribal policies and ethics to try to move the bar forward. Next slide, please. And so we've seen these changes already happening globally. and actually domestically through universities, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But globally, what we've seen nationally is uptake in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, where they already had better human rights, human subjects protocols and regulations in place. They've already in the past 5 years beefed up their, if you click one more time, their research protocols and regulations to align with rights around data. And we've not seen such action in the US yet. And so next slide, please. So we really need that action, because what we have going on is this movement that's gaining more and more speed toward open science and research mandates. We had the Nelson memo come out last year, which pushes any agency that in the federal government that grant makes to require that manuscripts, book chapters, data, and so forth are made open access and available to the public. And so Indigenous peoples aren't against open access, but we do want it regulated in a way that aligns with Indigenous peoples' rights and interests. And so one of the things I like to point out is that the NIH data sharing policy, which went into effect at the beginning of this year, has a supplement for research and data with American Indian, Alaska Native participants. And it particularly highlights the need to follow tribal law, policies, protocols, and preferences. And the reason why this is really important is because in the face of open science and these mandates to make data open, what NIH is saying is the tribe has the final rule about whether or not those data are made public. And it can be aligned with a written law, but it can also be because that is how they operate and in terms of protocols and preferences. And so the onus is on the researcher to really figure out what that is and to follow the tribal and be responsible to the tribe. Two other things I want to point out here is that we had the first White House Indigenous Knowledge Guidance. It was fascinating, I think, from a perspective of folks who deal with Indigenous knowledges, because it moved the language and the bar kind of beyond the traditional ecological knowledge perspective, which is a very Western term, to just Indigenous knowledges writ large. It didn't give any guidance on how to use or reuse knowledge into the future and how to care for and share those knowledges, which is disturbing in terms of data and data use and going forward. And then just an acknowledgement too here, we're a land grab university at the University of Arizona. We have therefore specific responsibilities to Indigenous peoples, to those who we've benefited from and those whose lands we're on as well. And so the university does promote specific activities, although did not respond specifically to this article, which I've seen other universities respond to specifically to. Next slide. So really the question becomes, how do we move institutions from these extractive transactional colonial data practices and reconfigure power relationships to put Indigenous data in Indigenous hands? And this is particularly important because if we're going to include Indigenous people's knowledges and data and science in science and technology advances, we must be able to maintain relationships between people's information and place within our technological infrastructure to both protect knowledge and data and allow Indigenous peoples to benefit from sharing knowledge and data on their own terms. And this onus cannot just be on the researcher, right? This has to be an institutional responsibility as well. Next slide, please. So when I'm talking about Indigenous data, the Indigenous perspective in terms of data has really broadened it beyond this kind of digital information definition to include data generated by Indigenous peoples as well as by governments, private sector, other institutions that are on and about Indigenous peoples, both as individuals and collectives. So about their communities and non-human relations as well. So it is information about our non-human relations, our land, our water, our secret ecosystems, data about us as individuals, and then data about us as collectives. So this is our traditional knowledge systems, our languages, and so forth. And so in a university setting, we find data across these types. And within many research projects, we also interact with data across these types. Next slide. So Indigenous data sovereignty has been a movement that is, as some elders have told me, is making what's old new again. So since about 2015, when the term was coined, we've been advancing the rights of Indigenous peoples to govern their data from collection and storage to use and reuse. And so the foundations for Indigenous data sovereignty are within that inherent sovereignty you heard me mention before. Only Indigenous peoples can express that. And Indigenous data sovereignty is a responsibility to the roles and responsibilities that we have within our communities. So we have these roles and protocols within our communities for the sharing and the use and the storage of information. And Indigenous data sovereignty elevates those and say, okay, what are those and how do we move them into the data and digital environment? Indigenous data sovereignty leverages tools such as laws, policies, and agreements, including the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, nation-state recognition of Indigenous peoples, also human rights, planetary rights. And so Indigenous data sovereignty underscores that knowledge belongs to the collective and is fundamental to who we are as Indigenous peoples. So two quick important points. Indigenous data sovereignty expands beyond mainstream data sovereignty, which focuses on digital information within geographical jurisdictions to allow persistent relationships with data, specimens, information, and knowledge across time and space. And Indigenous data governance seeks to change these relationships. So while only Indigenous peoples can enact Indigenous data sovereignty, we all have responsibilities around Indigenous data governance. Next slide, please. And so just to point out that like almost every community or nation, Indigenous peoples are seeking to access and benefit from their data, so have data for governance, while they're also simultaneously creating mechanisms for governing their own data. And this is, next slide please, important because they're dealing with a variety of different data actors. And so while Indigenous peoples can have and need access to their data are found in and stewarded by data repositories, by publishers, by researchers, universities, granting agencies, other governments, so on and so forth. And so having relationships among and with those other data actors is really important. Next slide, please. So in 2019, we formed the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, which is really working towards advancing Indigenous data sovereignty and governance globally. And next slide, please. Creating a network among the nation-state-based networks that already exist. So in 2016, we saw the Maori Data Sovereignty Network and the U.S. Data Sovereignty Network be created. We now have a new one that's not even on the slide now in Canada. So for the First Nations Information Governance Center has been around for over 20 years, and they steward, if anybody's heard, the OCAP principles, which is their 25th anniversary of the OCAP principles. But they're not a network per se, and so now there's a network of scholars and practitioners in Canada as well. So the Global Indigenous Data Alliance has worked at a global level, next slide please, to work and create advocacy, knowledge, and policy. And so we've supported the growth of networks within regions and nation states. We've promoted Indigenous data sovereignty and governance publications, which we've seen an explosion of in the past 2 or 3 years, promoting regional, national, and local frameworks. And so I'll talk about the CARE principles, but a regional framework would be the OCAP principles. Local frameworks would be tribal principles themselves for the care of data. We published the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance and then defined some COVID Indigenous data guidelines. Last year we published, or maybe it was earlier this year, a paper, and then also on our website, 12 rights that Indigenous peoples express around data, and we've bucketed them in data for governance and governance of data. And then we're working with the IEEE on a recommended practice for the provenance of Indigenous peoples' data. And IEEE is the Institute for Electronics and Electrical Engineering, but they set a lot of data standards internationally across sectors, and so a heavy hitting place to go. We did just release a university research data communique from GIDA, just a couple pages outlining what are the responsibilities of universities and related to data. And then finally, we're creating a care data maturity model, which I'll talk about briefly. Next slide. So in response really to the generation of data and open data, big data, and open science and research environments, and then as that shrinks the ability of Indigenous peoples to access and use and govern their data, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance shepherded through and released the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. And they really were created to be thoughtful about what Indigenous peoples were expressing differently from mainstream data efforts. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. And primarily what they do is shift the focus of data governance from consultation to values-based relationships. Next slide, please. And this one will have a lot of clicks in it. So the CARE principles include 4 principles and 3 sub-principles for each principle. So click. They include collective benefit, which details that data ecosystems shall be designed and function in ways that enable Indigenous peoples as collectives to benefit from data. Click. Authority to control emphasizes the need for those working with data to uphold Indigenous peoples' rights to and support their interest in data. If you click twice now. Yeah. You can click all the way through if you want. Responsibility reminds us that those working with Indigenous data must center Indigenous peoples' self-determination and collective benefit in the data relationship. So the responsibility to the C and the A. And then ethics focuses on using Indigenous peoples' own ethics to guide decisions on benefits, harms, justice, and future use. And so importantly, while the CARE principles do not set uniform standards to aspire to. Rather, they set the minimum expectations and direct those interacting with Indigenous data toward community-specific guidance for the care of knowledge. So a one-size-fits-all policy at scale that does not attend to the individual Indigenous people's rights, interests, and responsibilities doesn't really work. Next slide. So I don't know if folks here have heard about the FAIR principles, but we specifically packaged the CARE principles to be companion to the FAIR principles because the FAIR principles really detail a lot of attributes about data themselves that some Indigenous principles were talking about, but most Indigenous principles were talking about the elements of people and purpose, which are reflected within the CARE principles. And so implementation of CARE and FAIR principles together should be seen as necessary to allow Indigenous peoples to govern, access, and use their data and really to share on their own terms. Next slide. Unfortunately, though, the vast majority of Indigenous data ranging from ethnographic material to biological materials to Earth observations and so on are neither FAIR nor CARE. So Indigenous collections and data can be hard to find. They can be buried in larger collections, corporate data sets, university repositories, even researcher possessions. And so Indigenous data are often mislabeled. They do not indicate Indigenous peoples who are related to those data. And they are therefore not searchable. So Indigenous peoples are largely not their legal rights holders. Thus today, Indigenous collections and data are not fair and do not perpetuate Indigenous provenance, protocols for use and sharing, or permissions in them. I'm going to have you click twice now, please. And so what we're really thinking about is how do we enact responsibilities across institution types to scaffold and uphold Indigenous rights through the CARE principles and related activities, and then through enacting Indigenous people's own responsibilities. So I'm going to close now with some examples and then hopefully make the slides available because they'll have many more pieces on them. So next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about our 5 A's, which come from that 12 rights paper that I talked about, talking about authority, access, authorship, attribution, and acknowledgement. Next slide, please. And so around authority, we want to think about centering Indigenous peoples and people in leadership and scholarship. So seeking and paying for guidance from Indigenous leadership and scholars, allow us to steward conversations, use existing tribal expectations to set policies. I'll show you some examples soon. Support the growth of tribal policies and practices, and create and revise institutional policies and practices, and then fund tribes and Indigenous peoples and organizations. You know, I see the updated PAPPG, or the proposal guidance from the National Science Foundation, had language around actually grant making directly to tribes. So this is the kind of things that we're talking about. Next slide. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of how to change institutional policies to align with tribal expectations. So here, what we have in the US, one of the real strengths we have is that many tribes have review processes for research that are either federally regulated institutional review boards or their own laws or practices. And so in a review of 26 tribal research review practices, we looked at how they give guidance for enacting the care principles. So next slide, please. And so here you see for each care principle, one of the an element from each of different tribal research oversight document. And so with regards to collective benefit, the Cherokee Nation talks about the tribe will only support community engaged research practices, which requires a high level of collaboration with the Cherokee Nation. With regard to authority to control, the 3 affiliated tribes talks about the tribe and any human research subject at their discretion have the right to exclude from publication and to keep confidential any information. As with respect to responsibility, the correct tribe talks about reserving domains of knowledge for rightful and culturally appropriate owners, as well as restricting access to this knowledge during certain chronological periods. And so they are stewarding their knowledge and culture and saying we can restrict when this information can be made available. And finally, with ethics, we see the Turtle Mountain Chippewa talk about in their review, community knowledge networks and personnel and political or social power are other forms of equity that are useful to projects. So each of these commodities has values and must be shared between the researcher and the tribe if a proper agreement is to be formulated. So the importance of this is recognizing that while we move towards being more responsible to tribes, the demand on tribes increases, but we are responsible for knowing what the expectations are already. And so there are specific expectations that each tribe will set, but there's also, when you look across tribes, you can begin to see what these expectations are that are common across tribes. Next slide. Dr. Lydia Jennings, who's now at Arizona State University and Duke University, led this paper about applying the care principles to ecology and biodiversity research. I recommend it all to you. It's in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. It specifically has and talks about issues that are raised by communities and then actions that institutions and researchers can take. So in terms of data grounded in community values, aspirations, and research, and well-being, developing or using Indigenous data classifications and analysis frameworks that reflect community values, needs, and aspirations, including value local community experts in the research team. There's also a box that includes some examples of work and that have been done to implement the care principles that is good to read too. Next slide, please. One of the other things that Dominique David Chavez did in that paper where I showed you that, levels of engagement was detail some questions to ask yourself as a researcher that are adapted from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So these are very high level global expectations that the US has signed on to, but also come from Indigenous peoples' rights and were created across decades. And so some of the ones that I like to point out are to what level do Indigenous community members have authority regarding the implementation of research, and also how were Indigenous community members credited, because this predisposes us to my next point here, their knowledge contributions and efforts. So these are just good questions to think through and and analyze. Next slide, please. So I talked a little bit about the effort of at the Global Indigenous Data Alliance and through our Collaboratory to create indicators. This is in line with what they've done for the FAIR principles around different models of evaluating how they're being implemented. And so what we are doing are creating indicators for a maturity model for institutions and different institution types to assess how they're implementing the care principles, or actually to give guidance to how to implement them. And so you see in this panel just some of the recommendations and criteria that are being created. I'm going to flip to the next slide, which gives us a kind of hone in on each one of these. So for A1, one of the sub-principles that talks about recognizing rights and interests, we think through what are the implications for individuals. So for instance, explicit recognition of Indigenous data sovereignty and process tools and documents such as data management plans or contracts, or for institutions. Institution explicitly recognizes Indigenous data sovereignty in public-facing statements on institutional websites. And I'll show you some examples of that later. Next slide, please. Another example of how we're creating this criteria is through R3 for Indigenous languages and world views. And so for funders, we talk about funding policies mandate appropriate acknowledgement and attribution of Indigenous peoples, including co-authorship with community researchers. And then for repositories, policies ensure appropriate acknowledgement and attribution of Indigenous peoples, again, including co-authorship with community researchers. And so these are in process. We hope to have a kind of a beta version for testing by the end of next year. Next slide. These are two examples of policy work and thinking back to how we embed this within policy. One is through the IATSIS Code of Ethics, which is the Australian government statutory authority for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So they actually have a code now. This is new, I think, is of 21. And researchers, even government researchers, must be approved and adhere to this code. So this code has actually restricted people in, for instance, the Australian Bureau of Statistics from doing research that doesn't align, in that case, with these three things I've highlighted here, that Indigenous peoples have the right to manage the collection, interpretation, and use of their information, and the contribution of Indigenous peoples' knowledge, resource, and access to data should be acknowledged by ensuring ongoing ownership, control, and or access for Indigenous people to the research results, and they must follow the FAIR and CARE principles. And so this was one of the examples I was talking about when the federal government in Australia beefed up and included rights to data now in their research review policies. Next slide is from my own home institution here at the University of Arizona. And so we allow Indigenous data to be deposited into our open research data repository, which we call REDATA, under the condition that all human subjects research consent requirements have been met and that the sharing of such data has been approved by a tribal designee. So this kind of reflects that NIH policy that I mentioned earlier, where you have to have tribal permission to share these data. And so one of the other things that's really important is that this policy points towards other institutional, meaning at the University of Arizona, laws and guidelines. So we have so it points to tribal law and policy, obviously, but we have a Board of Regents policy for tribal engagement. We have guidelines for implementation of that policy at the University of Arizona. And then we have now, as of September, within our handbook of policies for the University of Arizona, a policy for tribal engagement as well. And so this really shows you how you can scaffold and actually interweave different policies at an institution to uphold Indigenous rights. And I would say it is extremely important to have that scaffolding in order to make sure that they are being upheld. I'll also give a nod to our Human Subjects Office, which has heightened responsibilities around Indigenous research and data as well, which is part of that scaffolding that we have here for depositing data into REDATA. And I'll tell you the first example that we had of somebody depositing data was around language data, and a interpretation and not considering Indigenous language data from Latin America to be Indigenous data. And so we had to revise the policy so it specifically delineated some of these. Next slide, please. I'm going to go through and skip a few of these slides, but leave them here so we can share the slides with you, because I think this section is important. But I'm going to talk about enriching metadata. So I told you about our efforts to create a standard for the provenance of Indigenous peoples' data. One of the tools that has been around for over a decade, next slide, has been through local context. They have labels for traditional knowledge and biocultural information that Indigenous communities can put in the metadata of label for data, and then they have notices that institutions and researchers can put on their data sets, their data, or their actual web pages. And so the traditional knowledge and biocultural labels establish Indigenous cultural authority, and it can only be applied by Indigenous communities. The labels themselves the notices here disclose interest that Indigenous peoples may have within holdings. And so I'm going to ask you to click twice. So what we see here is at the University of Tasmania, this is their page about open access. And so while they're talking about open access, right smack dab there is the Open to Collaborate notice, which designates and says to the world that our institution is committed to the development of new modes of collaboration, engagement, and partnership for the care and stewardship of past and future heritage collections. So what they're admitting to is that we hold stuff, we hold collections, we hold data that we know belong to you as Indigenous peoples and even other peoples that you don't have any relationship to, and we want to reestablish relationships around those data. So critical kind of like forward-facing statements. And then I will give, if you click to forward, I'll give another example of the Open Collaborate notice, which I think is really critical. One more. To discussion here. So Maine eDNA, which is a National Science Foundation funded repository, has a policy where they use the Open to Collaborate notice, and then they have the backup action to it. So what happens is, as a first step in the process of building and honoring these relationships between projects and Maine's Indigenous peoples and communities, this notice indicates the program's commitment, right, to new modes of collaboration, engagement, relationships for the care and stewardship, right? But what they do is, if they get data in and samples in that they know from geographical indicators or other indicators are related to a tribe, they notify the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer about the samples that were collected from their tribal lands, and work with them to apply any labels that they want to apply, so that they can more effectively monitor research activities and have protocols associated with the future use of those data. And then at the same time, it's recognizing the provenance on that data and so forth. Next slide. I'm going to close up with just some notes about authorship and acknowledgement. Authorship and acknowledgement, I think the bar should be that we should be inviting everybody, not just inviting, but authorship should include and be more broad than what we generally have within the scientific community. And so we need to think about who contributes to our research holistically. That is not how the scientific community has taught us to think about it, and who should be an author on this. And one of the problems we've had for a long time is that most of Indigenous knowledges are taken and then published, and then they're associated with somebody else's name. Our data are taken or published associated with somebody else. So we need to think through who is credited for knowledge and who has that relationship to knowledge in publications, research findings, repositories, and so forth. And so we've seen some advances in this arena over the past decade or so. There's been at the Canadian, I really like the Canadian Public Health journals process for ensuring that communities are involved in Indigenous research that's being published through their journal. I haven't seen anything as high level as that yet. And so they have a couple publications about their policies there that I think are really thoughtful and kind of move the bar forward. Next slide. One of the other things that's come out is a creation of standards for Indigenous cultural identity for research author standards. This is for health research publications, but I urge everybody to think how these are and can be done in other sectors and disciplines as well. And so, for instance, in that Nature paper that I talked about that Dr. Lydia Jennings led, they added a as well as having an acknowledgement section, there's also a section on positionality of the authors. And so that's a separate subsection. And then we put the Indigenous lands that we are on in our affiliation section. And so setting that bar in such a high level journal helped us then when we now are publishing in other journals to say, look, we want to include this information as well. And when they fight back, we say, look, it's in Nature. And so being able to make those changes in bit high impact journals, but also at like the big three publishing houses and that kind of stuff is critical. And so there's, ongoing efforts to make those changes because next slide, what we're really trying to do in the research environment is move from this kind of human subjects element that our framework for research has been for a long time to how do we think about protecting individual and collective privacy and confidentiality. So like a sole focus on personal identifiable information as sensitive really fails to fully identify the potential risks and harms, as well as the benefits of research to future generations. And so really kind of shifting towards this framework. And then my final slide just kind of is an overview of what we talked about. So really recentering us and remembering that sovereignty matters, data are our relations, data are critical to the exercise of sovereignty. As rights holders, only Indigenous peoples can exercise Indigenous data sovereignty, but enacting it includes both data for governance and the governance of data, which requires Indigenous peoples to create relationships with other data actors. And so finally, assertions of Indigenous data sovereignty spur innovation and design in data and research policy and practice. The CARE principles have really pushed the bar forward about thinking about collective rights within data, and Indigenous conceptions of data is not just digital information has really made us think about the impact of like how we reconstitute our 3D environment here today as everything is becoming technology, right? And as data are kind of blowing away from us into these big data sets and stuff, how do we maintain those relationships? And remember, at the end of the day, the data are about us and our relations. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I will turn things over to our students to facilitate the Q&A.
Sorry, I didn't hear. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Again, my name is Valerie Passion, and I'm here in the GES Grant Department, and I have a few questions that have come in throughout your presentation. The first one is, can you describe the difference between land grant and land grab universities? I know land grant universities have had special financial mechanisms to receive government research funding. If there is overlap between these categories, how can land grab universities leverage those mechanisms to their benefit?
Yeah, so land grab is the renaming of land grant institutions to acknowledge that that land was stolen and we established either institutions on those lands, or the institutions were established from money that was taken from the sale of those lands. And so our responsibilities as land grab institutions are significant. and mean that we need to be responsible to the peoples of our place, and then go from there in terms of creating those relationships. There are, different so a land grant designation does help you in getting grants, as well as something like an HSI, so Hispanic Serving Institution. So we need to remember, as an institution, when we have these designations, to not just leverage them for the institutional benefit, but also who are we benefiting, and what are their values and what are their desires? Because as you see, I mean, U of A is also a HSI. And so we need to be mindful of how we move forward in our research, and are we being responsible to these communities, or are we just actually, once again, extracting from them to benefit ourselves?
Thank you so much. The next question is from Larry. Would you like to unmute?
Oh, hi. I'm trying to turn my camera on as well. Okay. Hi. I have a question that's a little bit more individualized. Just to orient why I'm asking this question. I am a Black queer therapeutic practitioner who's interested in and has experience using like psychedelics in therapeutic intervention. And as I'm about to graduate and become a practitioner, understanding, specifically when you were talking about the management of like non-human relations, I know that like biodata and like biocultural data also includes like plant teachers. And so like I also, on the other side of it, recognize that like part of recovery from colonial violence can include like working with medicine teachers. And then also there is this like burgeoning kind of they're calling it the psychedelic renaissance, where essentially Western medicine is now being like, okay, we think it's acceptable to begin researching these things. And it's obviously in no way including Indigenous voice, specifically at like Johns Hopkins is one of the largest funded institutions. And I've never met anyone who's working there who has any knowledge of like how this is used currently or like managed. So like, where can I, as a practitioner, kind of starting to engage with biocultural data, even begin to formulate like what is an ethical way for me to do it individually, and then maybe on like an organizational level, like working with like a nonprofit or something, like what that would look like?
Yeah, you bring up a really good question, because like plant relatives, right? And is a very sticky situation, because there's both the extraction of and use of plants for commercial purposes, right? Which happens a lot. And then there is also the like you pointed out, this kind of individualized, like if you go and receive teachings, right? And so what are your responsibilities? I'm going to say two things about this. One is that so if somebody holds teachings, they hold those teachings within the context of a community. And so they have responsibilities to those teachings for themselves and to the plants, but also to their communities. Generally, most of the time, people are aware of those contexts, but not always, because different kind of, you know, capitalistic stuff comes in sometimes, right? But I think in terms of like individually moving forward to be responsible to, like in that case, you're being responsible to peoples, right? But also to the plants, because there are those relationships that are there, is really important. And I think one of the steps is starting to explore what it means to be responsible to the plant. I do think that allows you to then loop back to the peoples, because especially when we're using a plant in an extracted environment, so we're not using it in the environment where it comes from, right? We don't maintain that relationship. So thinking about how to maintain that relationship and reestablish that relationship is critical. And I think it actually gives more power to the plant and to kind of like the recovery process in that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Next, we have a two-part question. The first part is, do you find the U.S. government's movement to scale up open science, open data challenging to protect Indigenous data governance? And the second part is, do you see artificial intelligence as a threat to Indigenous data sovereignty or an opportunity?
I think both of them are a threat and an opportunity. I do think that as open science has become more and more du jour, that thankfully people are becoming better at understanding what the real purpose is behind it. There's a mantra out of the European Union around as open as possible, as closed as necessary. And that just means that you do it responsibly, right? Not everything has to be open because there's issues around it, right? And different people or different peoples have rights around those data, and also data are weaponized a lot. And so especially in our context and some other contexts, data are weaponized in different ways. But I do think that there is more and more understanding actually from scientists themselves now. The trickiest part for me is I find universities to be the least understanding of the complexities. So they might take that the funder is saying you have to make this open, right? And so the university is like, you have to make this open, or this is how it is. And so we're educating that open means everything needs to be open, when that is not the intent from any federal government agency. And you see that in various languages from the Office of Science and Technology Policy down through the agencies that are grant making. And so I think that there is hopefully some ground to make really responsible open science happen, because this is not, Indigenous data sovereignty or kind of is not against open access, or actually we want more open access to publications, for instance. We don't want those paywalls that we have all the time. And then your second question was about AI, which is I was in a meeting on trying to figure out for research institutions, how we move forward around data. And of course, AI was a big issue. Decarbonization was a big issue. But when we decided what we were going to do in terms of our movements forward, our movements all focused on what I would call the fundamentals. So making sure that we are promoting the care principles, but also thinking about what are a set of principles or actions that might need to be taken to protect other marginalized populations within AI and other movements forward around data. And then also, how do we begin to make sure that people are educated so that anyone in data science has a certain level of education around ethics and responsibilities around data and data harms and all of that kind of stuff. But then anybody in any discipline has some data science education and some of the data science ethics pieces of it. And so that was really revealing to me, because I thought it was just, me and those of us who are working more on the kind of like ethical, social, legal implications of stuff who are thinking about that. But more and more scientists are also starting to, and there were actually some corporate entities there starting to think about how do we make sure as we move forward with AI that we have the fundamentals taken care of first, because there are some huge opportunities for AI, and but there's also a lot of risk.
Thank you. And I know we're at 12:30 and we have like two questions that we didn't quite get to. How should I field those remaining questions?
Do we have 2 more minutes, Stephanie, or are you at time?
I can take just a quick 2 more minutes. I just need to message.
Perfect. Maybe just one quick question of those then, Val.
Okay, the next one is a bit of a longer question, so I'm not sure, Jessica, if you want to unmute to ask you.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Carroll. I'll try to be brief, I guess. I wrote this in the chat. I'm trying to figure out how to make sure that there's Indigenous authority over my dissertation work without being extractive, because I would be gaining a degree out of it, right? And so I don't have Indigenous scholars that I have worked with here at UMBC. And so I would have to ask an Indigenous scholar from that I have a connection with, and there's a variety of options from a different university to serve in that capacity, or I would have to try to create some kind of an advisory board, which would remove that authority and put it kind of on my own accountability or recognizance instead. And I feel like the authority to say, no, this is not acceptable, you can't proceed without making something right, I feel like that's important. And I'm just interested in your thoughts about how I might proceed. I'm interested in your opinion. I've kind of been trying to gather ideas while I think about my next steps.
Yeah, this is a hard one because you put your finger on kind of the burden issue, right? And so I think for me, like personally, I'm more likely to be on somebody's committee if I'm vested in them and the work that they're doing. And so whether that be from like as a special member on somebody's committee elsewhere, or a committee member from within the institution. And so I think I would think about it in terms of relationships. Either what are the relationships that you already have or that you think are important to create moving forward.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carroll. This was fantastic, and we are just thrilled that you were able to take the time to be with us today. So thank you so much. For those of you who attended, if we have your permission to share slides, we'll do that. We also have one of the papers that were mentioned, and we will send all of that information out to folks who attended after the fact.
So
Okay.
interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, definitely. You can share my slides if you PDF them. That's
perfect. Will do.
And then I'll send you, we just had another paper come out yesterday, so I'll send you that one too.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you all so much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.